Jer Bulsara outlived her son by 19 years. She died in 2016 at the age of 94, and in those 19 years she gave almost no interviews, made almost no public statements, and spoke about Freddie Mercury to the outside world with the careful restraint of someone who understood that his memory belonged to millions of people, and that her private experience of losing him belonged only to her. What she knew about her son, the full truth of what he had hidden from her across the final years of his life, the specific shape of what she learned after he was gone, has never been fully documented. Not in the authorized biographies, not in the documentaries, not in the accounts that the people around Freddie Mercury have given across the 3 decades since his death. Jer Bulsara's experience of losing her son is one of the most private and one of the least examined chapters in the entire Queen story. And the reason it has remained private is not that it was concealed or protected by the machinery that manages Freddie Mercury's legacy. It is simply that Jer Bulsara chose silence with the same completeness and the same dignity that her son had chosen it before her. She knew what he had hidden. She knew when she learned it, and she carried it for 19 years without asking anyone outside her immediate family to carry it with her. The relationship between Freddie Mercury and his mother, Jer Bulsara, was one of the most consistent and least publicly discussed elements of his private life. He called her every week. This is a detail that appears in multiple accounts from people who knew him during the various periods of his life, from the years of his earliest success in the early 1970s through to the final months of his illness in 1991. Every week, regardless of where he was or what he was doing, Freddie Mercury called his mother. Not his father, with whom his relationship was more complicated and more distant. His mother. The relationship between them was shaped by everything that the Bulsara family had been through together: the displacement from Zanzibar in 1964, the difficult early years in Feltham, the gradual and then dramatic transformation of their son from Farouk, the shy teenager, into Freddie Mercury, the global rock star, and by the specific quality of the bond between a mother and the child who has always been, in some way she could not entirely articulate, but could always feel, different from what she had expected, and more than she had allowed herself to hope for. The Bulsara family's journey from Zanzibar to England in 1964 was not a gentle transition. It was a displacement, sudden, traumatic, and total. Freddie was 17 when the family left. They arrived in Feltham in a damp flat, in a gray English winter, carrying what they had been able to bring and leaving behind the life they had built across 3 generations of Parsi migration through India and East Africa. Jer Bulsara had organized her family's existence around a set of values: hard work, family loyalty, private dignity, the Zoroastrian faith that gave structure and meaning to everything else that had served them in Zanzibar, and that she transported intact to England, where they were not always easy to maintain, but were never abandoned. Freddie, in the years that followed, moved progressively further from the surface conventions of the world his parents had constructed: the flamboyance, the sexuality, the deliberate self-creation of a persona that bore little relationship to Farouk Bulsara from Feltham, while maintaining, quietly and consistently, the connection to his mother that was one of the few things in his life that did not require performance. Across the years of Queen's success, Freddie Mercury was careful about what he allowed his parents to know and to be exposed to. His father, Bomi, who struggled with his son's lifestyle and his son's choices, was a source of complicated feeling that Freddie managed by maintaining a careful distance. His mother, Jer, was different: closer, warmer, more accepting, but still someone he protected from the full truth of certain things. He did not speak to her about his sexuality with the directness that he brought to his conversations with Mary Austin or with the people of his inner circle. He did not take her into the specific world of his private life in Munich or in the clubs and social spaces of London, where the private Freddie existed most freely. He gave her the version of his life that she could receive with comfort: the career success, the music, the fact that he was well and working and surrounded by people who cared about him. He called her every week and told her what she needed to hear to believe that her son was all right. In 1987, when Freddie Mercury received the AIDS diagnosis and made the decision that the world, including almost everyone in his life who was not in the band, would not be told, The question of what to tell his mother became one of the most specific and most painful consequences of that decision. Jer Bulsara was in her mid-60s, living with Balmy in the family home in Feltham, following her son's career with the particular mixture of pride and occasional bewilderment that she had always brought to it. She had no reason to suspect that anything was fundamentally wrong. Freddie was working, he was recording, the band was making music, and every week the phone rang. And Freddie's voice came through the receiver, and he asked how she was and told her fragments of what was happening in his life and listened to her news and said goodbye and hung up. And in none of those conversations, across the 4 years between the diagnosis and his death, did he tell her what he was living with. The weekly phone calls between 1987 and 1991 were the specific site of the concealment, the place where Freddie Mercury performed. Week after week, the most sustained and most intimate act of protection of his entire life. Not a performance for a stadium, a performance for one person. The weekly call was a fixed point in Freddie's life across decades, and its continuation through the illness years required from him something that the performances at Wembley or Live Aid had never required. The sustained management of a voice that he knew his mother was listening to with the specific attentiveness of a parent. An attentiveness that could hear things in a voice that a general audience would miss. Jer Bulsara had been listening to her son's voice since he was a baby. She knew every inflection of it. She knew when something was wrong. And Freddie Mercury, calling her every week while his body was failing and while the specific knowledge of how it was failing was being kept from her, had to manage that attentiveness with a care and a precision that was in some ways the most extraordinary performance of his life. The voice changed. It is impossible that it did not change across the 4 years of the illness. And it is impossible that Jer Bulsara, listening to it every week across that time, did not notice the changes. What she understood about those changes, whether she attributed them to age or to tiredness or to the general wear of a demanding career, or whether she began to sense something she could not name, is not documented in any account that has been made public. What is documented in fragments across the accounts of people who knew both Freddie and his family during this period is that Jer Bulsara was not told the truth about her son's illness while he was alive. That decision was Freddie's. He had made it across the entirety of the 4 years, week by week, call by call, managing the sound of his own deterioration through a telephone line connecting Kensington to Feltham, protecting the woman who had carried him through the displacement of 1964 and who had given him the specific quality of quiet love that he had drawn on for his entire life. By the autumn of 1991, the calls had changed in ways that went beyond the voice. They were shorter. Freddie's energy for conversation had diminished in proportion to his physical decline, and the calls that had once lasted for the ordinary duration of a weekly family conversation, 20 minutes, half an hour, unhurried in the way of people who knew they would speak again, the following week had become briefer, more effortful, more precious in a way that neither party could fully acknowledge, without acknowledging everything that neither of them was saying. People who were around Freddie during this period have described his relationship with the phone in his final months as something that had taken on a specific weight, that he made fewer calls, spoke for shorter periods, conserved the energy that conversation required in a way that was consistent with everything else about how he was managing the final stage of his illness. The calls to Jer continued. They were among the last he made, and they were, by every account and every implication available, the calls he managed with the greatest care. The last phone call between Freddie Mercury and his mother, Jer Bulsara, took place in the days before his death on the 24th of November, 1991. The precise date and the precise contents of that call are not part of the public record. What is known is that the call happened, that it was short, and that it ended in the way that calls between a mother and her son end, with the ordinary language of love and of parting that people use when they cannot say what they actually mean and what they actually feel, and so say instead the words that serve in place of those things. I love you. Take care of yourself. I will speak to you soon. The specific version of those words that Freddie Mercury used to say goodbye to his mother for the last time belongs to Jer Bulsara. She has kept it. She kept it across 19 years of widowhood and of private mourning and of occasional careful engagement with the public world's hunger for information about her son. She kept it until her death in 2016. It is among the most private things in the entire story of Freddie Mercury's life. On the 24th of November, 1991, Freddie Mercury died in the early evening at Garden Lodge. The news was communicated first to the people who were in the immediate circle, Mary Austin, Peter Freestone, Jim Hutton, the band members, and then, through the channels that such news travels through, to the wider world. How Jer Bulsara was told who called her, at what time, in what words is not documented in the accounts that have been made public. What is documented is that she was told, and that in being told, she received the news she had been protected from knowing fully across 4 years of weekly phone calls, 4 years of Freddie Mercury managing her experience of his illness with a sustained and exhausting and completely successful care. She had known perhaps in the way that mothers know things without being told them in the voice, in the brevity of the calls, in the specific quality of a son who is saying more by saying less. But knowing and being told are different things. And the 24th of November, 1991 was the day she was told. What Jer Bulsara learned after her son was gone, the full truth of what he had been living with, the specific nature of the illness, the timeline of how it had progressed, the decisions that had been made about who to tell and when and how much arrived in the way that such information tends to arrive after a death. In fragments, through multiple sources, over a period of time that made the accumulation of understanding as difficult as any single revelation could have been. She learned that her son had known since 1987. She learned that the decision to conceal it from her had been made not from indifference to her, but from a very particular form of love, the specific love of a person who has spent a lifetime protecting someone from difficulty and who has chosen, in the face of the greatest difficulty of his own life, to continue that protection until it was no longer possible. Whether Jer Bulsara found comfort in that understanding, or whether the knowledge that she had been protected from the truth produced in her something more complicated than comfort, is not something she ever said publicly. Kashmira Cook, Freddie's younger sister, has been the primary voice of the Bulsara family in the public conversations about Freddie Mercury's life and death across the decades since 1991. She has spoken carefully and with evident love and has described in fragments across various interviews something of what the family's experience of Freddie's illness and death was like from the inside. She has described the family as one that processed its grief privately, in keeping with both its Zoroastrian faith and its ingrained instinct toward dignity in the face of difficulty. She has spoken of her mother with consistent tenderness and has communicated, without stating it directly, that Jer Bulsara's experience of losing Freddie was the defining loss of her later life, the thing that reorganized everything that came after it, and that she carried it in the Bulsara family way. Quietly, without public display, with the particular form of strength that is produced not by the absence of feeling, but by the decision not to make one's feeling a public event. Jer Bulsara gave almost no interviews in the 19 years between Freddie's death and her own death in 2016. She was not a recluse. She maintained relationships with the people who had been part of Freddie's life, attended certain events connected to his memory, and was present in the lives of her daughter Kashmira and her grandchildren. But she did not speak to the press. She did not participate in the documentaries. She did not attend the premiere of the Bohemian Rhapsody film in 2018 because she had died 2 years before it was released. The world's understanding of her experience of losing her son comes almost entirely from the oblique accounts of other people and from the inference that her sustained public silence invited. She was a private woman whose son had been one of the most public figures of the 20th century. She had navigated that paradox across 2 decades of his career, and she navigated the grief of losing him with the same quiet and the same dignity and the same refusal to make her interior life available for public consumption. The love between Freddie Mercury and his mother, Jer Bulsara, was one of the most private and most constant things in his life. It was present in the weekly phone calls across 20 years of career and illness and the sustained performance of normality that the illness required. It was present in the specific quality of the concealment, in the fact that of all the things Freddie Mercury chose to hide from the world, the one he was most sustained and most thorough in hiding from his mother was his dying, because the thought of her knowing and being unable to help him was, in his understanding, worse than the dying itself. And it was present, finally and definitively, in the truth she learned after he was gone, not as a wound, not as a betrayal, but as the last and most complete expression of a love that had operated across his entire life in the same way, by putting her comfort before his own honesty, by managing her experience of him with the same care that he brought to managing the experience of 72,000 people in a stadium, and by understanding with the specific intelligence of someone who has spent a lifetime in the businesses of knowing what an audience needs, that what she needed in the end was to remember her son as she had always known him, alive, calling every week, hers.